Ukraine just pulled off a move so precise, so calculated, and so quietly devastating that even its closest partners in the West didn't see it coming until the results were already playing out over the skies of the Middle East. What happened wasn't a dramatic missile launch caught live on TV. It wasn't a flashy summit with flags, speeches, and photo ops. It was something far more dangerous for its enemies. A strategic shift, built in silence, tested under fire, and then deployed exactly where it would hurt Iran and Russia the most. For years, Iran believed it had discovered the perfect way to threaten its neighbors without ever fighting a conventional war. Instead of building massively expensive fighter jets or giant fleets, it focused on something far cheaper and far more flexible: suicide drones. Not one or two at a time, but swarms. Waves of small, relatively crude Shahed drones sent out in numbers designed to overwhelm defenses, exhaust budgets, and terrify civilians. Each of those drones might cost roughly the price of a mid-range car to manufacture, but the response needed to stop them? That was where the real power of the strategy lived. Every time a Gulf state tried to protect itself, it had to respond with high-end air defense systems, Patriots, THAAD, and other interceptors that can cost millions of dollars per shot. The math was brutal and simple. A drone that costs tens of thousands forced the defender to fire a missile costing millions. One attack wasn't just an act of aggression, it was a financial trap. Iran didn't need to win in terms of territory, it only needed to keep the equation unbalanced. Every drone that forced an expensive interception was another quiet victory, another reminder that defending against Iran's reach would always be more expensive than attacking. This is why Iran's drone program wasn't just about hardware. It was about psychology and economics. If you can make your enemies feel like they're bleeding money every time they try to protect their own infrastructure, you slowly gain leverage without ever formally declaring war. That's exactly what Iran did, over energy facilities, ports, desalination plants, and symbolic targets that sent a clear message. We can reach you anytime we want, and you can't afford to stop us forever. But there was a flaw in that logic, a flaw that didn't become obvious until Iran and Russia tried the same playbook somewhere else. They didn't just use those Shahed drones in the Gulf, they used them over Ukraine. Night after night, for years, Russia launched Iranian-made drones toward Ukrainian cities, power plants, warehouses, and neighborhoods. The goal was the same: crush morale, destroy critical infrastructure, and force Ukraine to burn through expensive air defense missiles until the country simply couldn't afford to keep going. There was just one problem. Ukraine didn't have the luxury of firing multi-million-dollar interceptors at every incoming drone. It couldn't play that game for long. It didn't have the financial cushion of a wealthy Gulf monarchy. What it did have were desperate engineers, frontline improvisers, and a national instinct that had been sharpened by sheer necessity: innovate or die. Out of that pressure cooker came something Iran never accounted for, a way to flip the very cost equation that made its drone strategy so powerful. Instead of relying solely on classic air defense systems, Ukraine started pushing cheap, fast, maneuverable interceptor drones into the fight. These weren't hobby toys. They were purpose-built FPV interceptors designed to hunt down incoming drones in the sky. Guided by operators and increasingly supported by AI, they turned into aggressive little drone killers that could be deployed for a fraction of the price of traditional missiles. Suddenly, the math changed. Why fire off a missile worth millions when you could send a drone worth a couple thousand to knock a Shahed out of the sky? Inside Ukraine, this wasn't a theory. It was tested in real time over real cities under real bombardment. Every night added new data, every intercepted drone added new insights. Engineers refined software, tweaked flight patterns, optimized explosive payloads, and adjusted tactics. Over months and then years, Ukraine did something no defense contractor in a peaceful environment could have done at the same speed. It built the most battle-tested, cost-effective anti-drone ecosystem on the planet. But the real shock to the world didn't come from what Ukraine built. It came from where it decided to deploy that system next. In March 2026, something strange started happening on diplomatic trackers. Ukraine's president quietly appeared on flight manifests, bound not for European capitals or Washington, but for the Gulf. There were no loud press conferences, no dramatic speeches in front of flags. Instead, there were closed-door meetings, motorcades slipping through city streets, and short, controlled media statements that seemed almost deliberately bland. On the surface, it looked like a routine diplomatic tour. Underneath, it was anything but. Within days, reports began to emerge of long-term defense agreements being signed between Ukraine and several of the most powerful states in the Gulf: Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. These weren't simple arms sales. They weren't trial contracts or short-term leases. These were 10-year strategic agreements that went far deeper than "you buy, we deliver." They included joint production, technology transfer, and the integration of Ukrainian defense capabilities directly into Gulf infrastructure. Think about that for a moment. The same country that Russia tried to isolate and strangle economically was now signing decade-long deals with some of the richest energy exporters in the world. Instead of being cut off from global capital, Ukraine found itself plugged directly into some of the largest sovereign wealth funds on the planet. Instead of pleading for military aid, it was being paid to provide it. That alone would have been enough to raise eyebrows in Moscow and Tehran. But what came next made those governments realize just how badly they had misread the situation. Almost immediately after those agreements were signed, something else changed in the Gulf, this time in the air, not on paper. Observers began to notice Ukrainian personnel operating quietly inside the air defense networks of several countries. These weren't ceremonial advisors, they were specialists. Teams of Ukrainian anti-drone operators, engineers, and intelligence officers started appearing in key locations close to critical energy infrastructure and strategic sites. They didn't come to observe, they came to fight. Before long, footage began surfacing, first in snippets, then in fully verified segments. In several Gulf states, Ukrainian-operated interceptor drones were seen rising into the night sky to meet incoming threats. They weren't firing Patriot missiles. They weren't launching Shahed interceptors. They were using the same kind of FPV drone technology that Ukraine had developed and refined in the crucible of its own defense. Under the guidance of Ukrainian teams, these low-cost interceptors began meeting Iranian-made drones mid-flight and tearing them out of the air. For years, Shahed drones had been symbols of unavoidable pressure. They slipped past defenses, forced multi-million-dollar responses, and haunted radar screens. Now, they were being chased, hunted, and annihilated by weapons that cost a fraction of their price, often live on camera, with international media and independent analysts watching. In a single move, Ukraine didn't just protect Gulf targets. It shattered the aura of invincibility that Iran had spent years building around its drone arsenal. What made this shift even more brutal for Iran was what sat behind those visible interceptions. The Ukrainian system in the Gulf was not a single tool, it was a layered ecosystem. That ecosystem began working long before a drone ever appeared on a radar screen. Signal intelligence networks picked up telltale electronic signatures, acoustic sensors listened for the distinctive buzz of the engines, sounds Ukrainian experts had learned to recognize instantly after years of absorbing attacks. Mobile radars tracked trajectories. Electronic warfare platforms probed for opportunities to jam or mislead guidance systems. Sometimes a drone could be thrown off course just by scrambling its navigation data. When that wasn't enough, the interceptors were launched. Small, aggressive, and cheap, they closed in fast and ended the threat with direct impact. No spectacle, no dramatic missile plume reaching into the clouds, just a quiet, efficient kill that gave defenders something they hadn't had in a long time: financial breathing room. In that moment, the cost equation that Iran believed would guarantee its leverage began to crumble. When you have to spend tens of thousands of dollars for each drone you build, but your enemy can destroy that drone with something costing a fraction of that amount, your advantage evaporates. You're no longer bleeding their budget, you're burning your own, and Iran wasn't the only one with a problem. Russia had spent years selling itself as a reliable, battle-tested weapons supplier to the Middle East. Its air defense systems, radar networks, and various platforms were marketed as proven solutions for exactly the kind of threat Iran's drones represented. Governments from North Africa to the Gulf had purchased Russian systems believing they were buying security. But over time, those systems began to show cracks, especially in Ukraine and Syria. Videos circulated showing drones slipping past, systems failing to respond in time, and expensive equipment turning out to be far less effective than advertised. Now, those same customers were watching Ukraine, a country Russia had tried to conquer, take on the very threat Russia's gear was supposed to handle, and do it better, cheaper, and faster. When Gulf leaders watched Ukrainian-made solutions outperform expensive traditional systems, they weren't just impressed, they started making decisions. Contracts that would have gone to Moscow began shifting toward Kyiv. The consequences for Russia's economy and influence were enormous. Arms exports have long been one of the pillars of Russia's international power. Every missile system installed in a foreign country was not just a sale, it was a foothold, a relationship, a lever. But what happens when your supposed cutting-edge technology starts getting overshadowed by the inventions of the very country you tried to break? That's what Moscow is now confronting. Each new Ukrainian Gulf contract isn't just revenue for Kyiv, it's a public reminder that Russia's legacy systems are losing their edge and their market. Here's where the irony cuts the deepest. The only reason Ukraine became this good at countering Iranian drones is because Iran and Russia spent years throwing those drones at Ukraine in the first place. Russia received early versions of the Shahed, refined them, improved their navigation, and fed that technology back to Iran in the hope of creating a more capable pressure tool against Western allies. Together, they believed they were turning Iran into a sharper spear aimed at the Gulf and at Ukraine itself. But every upgrade they made, every improvement to the drone's capabilities, fed back into Ukraine's learning loop. Each new variant forced Ukrainian engineers to study more, adapt more, and design more effective counters. Without intending to, Russia and Iran built the ultimate training regime for Ukraine's drone defense community. For 4 years, Ukraine essentially lived inside a live-fire laboratory supplied by its enemies. The result is the system now operating in the Gulf. The very drones that once screamed toward Ukrainian cities have become the perfect test subjects for a technology stack now being used to protect countries Iran wanted to pressure and Russia wanted to court. The boomerang effect is hard to miss. The weapon they invested in for years is being disassembled in midair, on video, by the people who survived it. Inside Iran, that kind of failure doesn't stay external. When a regime sells its people and its allies on the idea of a powerful deterrent, and that deterrent starts falling apart in real time, questions follow. Billions spent on development, production, and deployment begin to look like a sinking investment. Officials who argued that drones were the perfect asymmetric tool now have to explain why they're getting shot down before reaching their targets. Generals who once boasted about reach and power suddenly have to account for missed strikes and neutralized operations. Iran's entire regional playbook relies on creating plausible deniability while maintaining undeniable threat. It uses proxies, militias, and covert operations to keep opponents off balance. But that only works if those tools still inspire fear. If drones become predictable, interceptable, and economically self-destructive, the psychological weight behind them begins to fade. Allies who once looked at Iran as a necessary partner in a dangerous region might start to see it as a state whose biggest bet has stalled. Proxies counting on Iranian weapons to shift local balances might start reconsidering their confidence. Meanwhile, in the Gulf, the mood is shifting in the opposite direction. For years, leaders in Riyadh, Doha, and Abu Dhabi have watched global powers play their own games over the region. They've seen Washington step in and step back, sometimes forcefully, sometimes hesitantly. They've watched Moscow try to present itself as an alternative guarantor of security. They've listened to promises from multiple capitals about protection, stability, and deterrence. Now, they're dealing with a country that didn't come with grand ideological visions or decades of entangling commitments. Ukraine showed up with one thing: proven, battle-hardened expertise in the exact kind of conflict the Gulf is facing. It didn't arrive with a list of demands about internal politics, religious alignment, or long lectures about regional reform. It arrived with data, software, hardware, and specialists who could start making a difference the moment they plugged into the system. For Gulf states, that kind of partnership is priceless. It means they don't have to choose between being dependent on Washington, tied too closely to Moscow, or cornered by Tehran. Instead, they gain a new axis, one built around shared security interests and measurable performance. It's not about who they pray to, which ideology they follow, or which bloc they publicly lean toward. It's about who can protect their skies, their pipelines, and their people most effectively. For Ukraine, this isn't just about prestige. It's about survival turned into strength. Those 10-year agreements represent more than diplomatic trophies. They're financial lifelines, industrial partnerships, and long-term markets for technologies born out of Ukraine's hardest days. Every facility built with Gulf capital, every production line running in partnership with Ukrainian engineers, helps ensure that Kyiv's defense industry isn't just a wartime patchwork held together by emergency spending. It becomes a durable, export-ready sector, capable of sustaining Ukraine well beyond the immediate conflict. And that is exactly what Moscow miscalculated. The Kremlin believed that by dragging Ukraine into a long, exhausting war, it could grind down the country's economy, drain its manpower, and isolate it diplomatically. The plan was to force Ukraine into dependence or collapse. Instead, Ukraine has used the pressure to evolve faster than anyone expected. Far from isolating Kyiv, the war has turned it into a hub for technology, for tactical knowledge, and now for security partnerships stretching far beyond Europe. When future analysts look back at this moment, they won't just see another chapter in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. They'll see a pivot point in how power works across the Middle East. The old dividing lines, Sunni versus Shia, pro-West versus anti-West, US versus Russia, are being joined by a new divide: who controls the tools of modern warfare and who understands how to counter them. On one side, Iran and Russia, heavily invested in methods that no longer scare their opponents the way they once did. On the other, Ukraine and its new partners, building a flexible defense architecture that is proving itself in real time. The truly unexpected part of this story is that none of it began as a grand master plan for the Middle East. Ukraine's first priority was simple: stay alive, stop the drones, protect its people, build anything that works. But in pursuing that goal relentlessly, it created something that other countries desperately needed. And that shift is rewriting the script everywhere from Tehran to Moscow to Washington. The skies over the Gulf used to be a symbol of vulnerability, a reminder that at any moment, engines could roar to life hundreds of kilometers away and send swarms of drones toward oil fields and critical infrastructure. Now those skies are turning into something else, a testing ground where Iran's most prized weapons are meeting the people who spent years learning how to kill them. Each interception tells a story. It's not just metal colliding in the air. It's a message sent back to the launch site. This no longer works the way you thought it did. Russia and Iran wanted to make Ukraine an example of what happens to a country that defies them. They succeeded, but not in the way they intended. Instead of a cautionary tale, Ukraine has become a case study in how a state under siege can adapt faster than its attackers, then export that adaptation to reshape distant regions. The boomerang they threw has completed its arc. The chaos they unleashed has arrived at their doorstep, carried not by missiles or tank columns, but by contracts, drones, and silent agreements signed in Gulf palaces. The next decade in the Middle East will not look like the last one. Energy will still matter. Religion will still matter. Great power competition will still matter. But layered on top of all that will be something new, the quiet influence of a country that was never supposed to survive, now helping decide whose drones fly and whose fall flaming into the sea. Ukraine isn't just defending its own borders anymore. It's exporting something far more dangerous to its enemies, stability for their rivals. And for Iran and Russia, that may be the most devastating twist of all. If you found this breakdown eye-opening and you want to understand how these kinds of moves keep reshaping the world behind the headlines, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for. Stick around, because what just happened between Ukraine, the Gulf, Iran, and Russia isn't a one-off event. It's the opening chapter of a much bigger story. Do you want the next script on this topic to focus more on Ukraine's tech innovation side, or on the internal political fallout inside Iran and Russia?